Just as extraordinary, Assange was harshly being kept in solitary confinement for breach of bail, what others might consider to be a penalty that is much harsher than would be normally expected. He wasn't a criminal that presented a threat to others in any way. It took a revolt by other prisoners for his prison conditions to be eased. His appearance in court earlier this year was in a cage, with restricted access even to his lawyers, which I would have thought would be totally against the legal system. Assange is not an English citizen, which all gives rise to concerns about his treatment, the process and his well-being. Nor has Assange been the only publisher of WikiLeaks material for which he is being pursued. As an Australian citizen, Julian Assange should be provided with Australian diplomatic support, the same as any other Australian who finds themselves in a similar situation overseas. He should be returned to Australia, and if the US government want to extradite him, they should apply to an Australian court under Australian law, where the principles of justice, as enshrined in Clause 29 of the 1215 Magna Carta, still hold true. The Julian Assange case is a test of Western democracy and the values that millions of lives have been lost defending. I refer to the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to know, upholding the Geneva Convention and the rules of military engagement, and the universal human rights of all people.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Vivian, playing cards. Collect the cards, connect the cards. I just popped out of my studio near the River Thames into Battersea Park. Julian Assange is America's most wanted man because he helped to expose American war crimes. He's a war hero. For that, they want to put him in concrete for 30 years. Julian knew this all along from various statements and emails, but now Trump has admitted it. Yet, Julian has never been charged with a crime. The Swedish allegations had no substance. That's why they had to drop them. I'm standing on the steps of the Buddhist temple in the park. I'm a Taoist, but I believe that everyone keeps the message of Jesus in their heart, that we should love each other. Julian Assange is the most famous victim of human rights abuse in the Western world, and he is a famous beacon of free speech. WikiLeaks never lies.
Hey-o, don't let me down, and sing with me, Free Julian Assange, Free Julian Assange, Free Julian Assange.
This is Radio Free Assange.
I'm quite proud of that. We have built a really grand project, in some ways a grand dream, to create a rebel library of Alexandria.
Hands up, Assange!
This is Radio Free Assange.
And we demand free Julian Assange! 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 No extradition! He wants extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free Julian Assange! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange. Journalism is not a crime. Free Julian Assange.
No extradition!
You are listening to Radio.
The best news of all is that courage is contagious. We have this myth sometimes, this myth that the future is something that is fixed, static, out there, waiting to happen to us. But the future doesn't happen to us. It's not fixed. It's not out there. The future is created by us, by the aggregation of the millions of choices each of us makes every day. And so I want to leave you with two questions. Number one, what is the future that we want to create? And number two, do we have the courage to create it?
You are listening to Radio Free Assange. Journalism is no crime. Jail the war criminals. Free Julian Assange.
In democracies, wars are a result of lies. And why one might think that that should lead us to a state of despair, it should lead us also to an optimistic understanding. Because if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth.
No extradition! It's only one decision! No extradition! It's only one decision! No extradition! It's only one decision! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
I'm Julian Assange.
Roger, I'll get you into space.
Editor of WikiLeaks. We've exposed the world's secrets.
These documents belong to the United States government.
Been attacked by the powerful.
The United States strongly condemns.
Hey, quit asking questions. He broke the law.
Illegally shoot the son of a...
Today, we're on a quest for revolutionary ideas that can change the world tomorrow.
Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange!
This is Radio Free Assange.
We are now approaching the state of Orwell's dictum. Perfect dictum, that he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls internet servers controls the intellectual record of mankind, and by controlling that, controls our perceptions of who we are, and by controlling that, controls what laws and regulations we make in society.
This is Radio Free Assange.
They are about to take every right away from you. You will not be able to fight for any other cause. We are talking about the fundamentals here. We must fight against an extradition. We must save Julian Assange.
every single, or all the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world dedicating significant resources over the past 10 years to destroying his reputation. So it's at a stage now where it's actually you risk something to even defend him. So the facts are very hard to get out, but when you start looking into it, you see that actually this is not a fair trial at all, and from start to finish it's been irregular, and it's actually a real stain on the British state and the British justice system that they won't live down. I mean, when Edward Snowden tweeted when Assange was grabbed from the embassy by British police, he said something along the lines of this will define Britain's attitude to the free press for generations, and it's true. I mean, that image will live in infamy. So we need to make sure Britain does not become a party to what would be one of the biggest nails in the coffin of the free press that the world has ever seen, maybe the biggest nail in the coffin. So, and for all the people that are watching who live in Britain, you live in the most important jurisdiction for any kind of activism on this topic, because if he goes to the US, he's got no chance. The real chance he has to avoid and his life be saved and avoid extradition is in the UK. So we really need to focus efforts in the run up to September to expose the irregularities, to expose the bias, and try and get justice.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We're discussing here whether Assange or someone else has done something wrong or not. But what about the war crimes? We are living in a time when our own war crimes are no longer prosecuted. We know that we have conducted aggressive wars. We've hanged people out of Nuremberg for this. 175 years for whatever we're accusing Mr. Assange of. It certainly is not violence, certainly is not genocide, certainly is not massacring civilians or torturing anybody. And people for genocide in The Hague, they receive 35 or 45 years.
Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange!
You're listening to
Free Assange
Radio!
This is Radio Free Assange.
Basically, I think that Julian Assange is he's a very brave guy. He's a fantastic journalist. He's one of the sort of he's basically being put in prison because he's too good. That's the problem. He's the promise of a free media, which we haven't really had before. We've just had propaganda, and I think that's basically why he's the sort of powerful states such as Britain and the US can't live with him.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free Julian Assange! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange. Journalism is not a crime. Free Julian Assange.
No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
Julian Assange! Good afternoon, Julian Assange. We are here to support you.
Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange!
23 hours a day in a cell in a high maximum security Ecuadorian embassy, and encourage us in our struggle. And in solidarity with Julian Assange.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Les pères fondateurs ne pensaient pas que la tyrannie puisse surgir de l'exécutif.
Because they did not parce qu'il ne voyait dans celui-ci rien d'autre que la simple exécution de ce qu'avait décidé le législateur.
In various form, I leave it at that. We know today.
Nous savons aujourd'hui que le plus grand danger de tyrannie vient de l'exécutif. Mais si nous prenons à la lettre l'esprit de la Constitution, que pensaient les pères fondateurs? Ils pensaient s'être libérés d'abord de la domination de la majorité. C'est pourquoi ce serait une grave erreur de penser que ce que nous avons est une démocratie. Ce que nous avons ici, c'est un système républicain. Les pères fondateurs s'attachaient surtout à préserver les droits des minorités parce qu'ils estimaient que dans un corps politique sain, il doit y avoir une pluralité d'opinions. Ce que les Français appellent l'union sacrée était précisément pour eux ce dont il ne fallait pas. Ce serait déjà une sorte de tyrannie et le tyran pourrait très bien être une majorité.
This is Radio Free Assange.
No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision!
We fell in love, and this is a person that I knew well by then, the person I know the most in this world. He's extraordinary. He's generous and he's very tender and loving. Forming a family was a deliberate decision to kind of break down those walls around him and see life, imagine a life beyond that prison. And so, while for many people it would seem insane to start a family in that context, for us it was the same thing to do. It was what keeps things real. And it does. It grounds me. And when Julian sees the children,
I'm pressed! I am pressed! I don't tell you down. Okay, I'm down. I'm down. I am pressed. Please.
We are at an extremely dangerous moment in the history of this country. Donald Trump wants to jail journalists who publish stories he doesn't like.
Do you mind telling me why I'm under arrest? Why am I under arrest?
And he's wielding the Espionage Act like a chainsaw against journalistic sources.
Find the leakers. We're going to find the leakers. We're going to pay a big price for leaking.
Let that sink in for a second. At the same time that the US government is chasing journalists all over the world, they have decided that all foreign journalists have no protection under the First Amendment in the United States. So that goes to show the gravity of this case.
Exactly what it looks like. We have a safely.
Amelia, can you hear us?
Amelia, you okay?
And I'll ask the same question: will you commit to not putting reporters in jail for doing their jobs?
Well, I don't know that I can make a blanket commitment to that effect. We will utilize the authorities that we have legally and constitutionally if we have to.
that it's another attack on free press. Just like Julian Assange, after publishing information that exposed government corruption, Glenn Greenwald from The Intercept has been charged.
The claim the Brazilian government used against me was one modeled after the Assange indictment.
It's a war on freedom of speech and it's a war on journalists.
The U.S. government is asserting universal jurisdiction to reach over to any journalist anywhere in the world that reports on it in a way that it doesn't like and prosecute them.
Mr. Assange was arrested this morning at about 10 o'clock at the Ecuadorian embassy. This precedent means that any journalist can be extradited for prosecution in the United States for having published truthful information about the United States.
Come on, fire!
First they came for Julian, they will come for everybody else. Our children, our friends.
There is a war on journalism, and Julian is at the center of that. But the point is that what happens to him can happen to any journalist who does his or her job.
How did we get here? The case against Julian Assange started a decade ago. But today it is the case that will define press freedom, and by consequence, your freedom of speech.
This is my philosophical background, how I see this work that we're doing, and maybe one other component, is that while we can all write about our own political issues, we can all push for particular things we can believe in, we can all have particular brands of politics, but I say it's all bankrupt. And the reason it's all bankrupt, and all current political theories are bankrupt, particular lines of political thought, is because actually we don't know what the hell is going on. And until we know the basic structures of our institutions, how they operate in practice, this titanic organisation, how they behave inside, not just through stories, but through vast amounts of internal documentation. Until we know that, how can we possibly make a diagnosis? How can we set the direction to go? Until we know where we are. We don't even have a map of where we are. So our first task is to build up the intellectual heritage that describes where we are. And once we know where we are, then we have a hope of setting course for a different direction. Until then, I think all political theories, to greater and lesser extent, of course, are bankrupt.
In 2011, a secret grand jury was meeting in Alexandria, Virginia, to consider indicting Julian Assange under the Espionage Act.
This isn't about who Julian Assange is, because that's been used so much as a distraction. I think so much of the negative press about Assange has been exactly about that. It's been exactly about, oh, we'll get people to ignore what the issues are because we'll get them to be distracted that this is not an issue about press freedom, it's actually about an individual. It's not, it's about press freedom. It doesn't matter who the individual was in that position needs to be defended. And in this case, it is Julian, but the role that he undertook is one that absolutely needs defended by the rest of the elite.
The Obama administration concluded that there was no way to charge Assange without endangering press freedom. However, in 2019, the Trump administration took a different approach.
In an unprecedented publishing U.S. military and diplomatic documents exposing U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Assange faces up to 170 years in prison under the new charges, 10 years for each count of violating the Espionage Act.
Julian Assange has been indicted under the Espionage Act with 17 separate counts related to his work as a publisher with WikiLeaks for having received and published classified information. Journalists around the world at The Guardian, The New York Times, and Spiegel at Le Monde also received and published that information, but that's true of journalists around the world all the time receiving information from government, including from the United States government. It does not make them spies.
Assange is charged with soliciting and receiving classified information. That's what I do for a living. I solicit and I receive information. I ask questions and I hope to obtain answers. Where there's evidence available, I try to get the evidence.
Journalists in the so-called mainstream, in its various forms, are now realizing that it concerns them. They come for Julian Assange, they'll come for you.
All these practices of encryption, helping your sources provide information legally, are important for letting citizens and the world know what's going on. Otherwise, we're dependent on our government to tell us what's up, and I don't think that's a dependable way to get information out to citizens. They won't do that.
Welcome to the State Department. I think we have some interns in the back. Welcome. Good to see you in this exercise in transparency and democracy.
Is that what it is? WikiLeaks is the most extraordinary development in journalism in my lifetime. WikiLeaks meant that everything you read was authentic, was accurate. You could judge it on its face value. There's no journalism, even the best, could never be 100% authentic and accurate.
In 2010, WikiLeaks started publishing the largest collection of US military and diplomatic secret documents in history. WikiLeaks first published a video of 2 American Apache helicopters murdering 11 people in Baghdad, among them 2 Reuters journalists.
This video, alongside maybe the images from Abu Ghraib, are in a sense what the Napalm Girl photo tells us about the Vietnam War. So it captures so many elements of the callousness, the bloodlust, and the horror of the Iraq War.
Light them all up.
002 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire!
If you watch it through, there's nowhere to go after it. You can't be rationalized. It can't be excused.
You don't need to be a specialist to see that US soldiers have been intentionally massacring people.
Come on, buddy. All I gotta do is pick up a weapon.
Even if some of them had carried arms, once they're wounded and out of combat, targeting them becomes a war crime. So it's obvious.
This is Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, we have a black SUV or a bongo truck picking up the bodies. Request permission to engage.
Bushmaster 7, roger. This is Bushmaster 7, roger, engage.
1-8, engage. Clear. Come on. Clear. Clear.
It was murder. 360-degree killing. That was the so-called philosophy of the war. In other words, you killed everything within 360 degrees.
The collateral murder video wasn't an isolated incident. WikiLeaks then published the Afghan and Iraq war logs, nearly 500,000 documents of detailed incident reports conducted by the US that depicted the true cost of those wars.
I'm not surprised by the data. What I am is deeply upset by the data. It's impossible to read the data. When you read about a 6-year-old being tortured to death with a drill, when you read about an entire family being wiped out in a split second because some 18-year-old American soldier has decided that the car was going too fast and just opened fire, when you hear about people being locked in a prison for 2 months and suspended from the ceiling by the Iraqi military, when you read stories about entire towns being decimated or children being killed by Hellfire missiles fired from US Apache helicopters because they were gathering firewood, all these stories are horrific. It's It's painful.
It is up to a court to decide clearly whether something is in the end a crime. That said, prima facie, there does appear to be evidence of war crimes in this material. An example is the Task Force 373 HIMARS missile strike on a house which killed 7 children. Well, we would like to see this material, the revelations that this material gives, be taken seriously, investigated by governments, and new policies put in place as a result, if not prosecutions of those people who have committed abuses.
No one has been prosecuted for this. We have clear evidence for systematic torture. Again, the whistleblower is the one who's being prosecuted, but not the perpetrators.
For just the third time since he was arrested over 2 years ago, alleged Army whistleblower Bradley Manning was seen by the public this week. His 3-day pretrial hearing wraps up today before a military court at Fort Meade in Maryland. Manning faces 22 charges, including the capital offense of aiding the enemy, as well as violating the Espionage Act, computer fraud, and theft of records. The 24-year-old private is accused of leaking hundreds of thousands of documents to the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks, including secret files on the Iraq and Afghan wars. Manning's attorneys are seeking the dismissal of 10 of the counts.
A few months after, WikiLeaks released Cablegate.
That's the scale of it, a vast leak of thousands of documents from US embassies and other diplomatic outposts across the globe in all those countries. There are stories from every country involved that will embarrass, intrigue, and potentially complicate international relations.
Among the specifics, worries about security at a Pakistan nuclear facility. Concern about alleged links between the Russian government and the mafia, plus allegations and examples of corruption within the Afghan government.
Britain's Guardian newspaper said some cables showed Saudi King Abdullah repeatedly urging the U.S. to attack Iran to destroy the program, and that leaders of other Arab nations referred to Tehran as an existential threat. Those documents...
I think for the general public, it was quite a revelation that people who have all the privileges of diplomats actually were behaving like thugs.
Italy's foreign minister calls the document release the September 11th of world diplomacy, in that everything once accepted as normal has now changed.
It was truth-telling of the most powerful kind, most fearsome kind, almost, and of course there was a reaction.
The United States strongly condemns the illegal disclosure.
I think the man is a high-tech terrorist. He's done enormous,
Assange.
Yes, he's done enormous damage to our country, and I think he needs to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And if that becomes a problem, we need to change the law.
The way to deal with this is pretty simple. We got special ops forces. I mean, a dead man can't leak stuff. This guy's a traitor, a treasonous, and he has broken every law of the United States. The guy ought to be, and I'm not for the death penalty, so if I'm not for the death penalty, I only want to do it, illegally shoot the son of a...
He's going to talk about WikiLeaks. You had nothing to do with the leaking of those documents.
It's disgraceful.
You do think it's disgraceful?
I think this should be like death penalty or something.
That reaction we now see encapsulated in the almost desperate bid by the United States to put Julian in a black hole and throw away the key. That's what they're talking about if he's extradited.
There is an attempt now, a very worrying attempt in the United States to erect a new precedent, which is that in the national security sector, that any journalist that corresponds with a source is committing espionage if at some time a classified communication is made. If I am a conspirator to commit espionage, then all these other media organizations and the principal journalists in them are also conspirators to commit espionage.
That's absolutely true. Yes, that's absolutely true, Jim. I hadn't spotted that. I was so excited by the fact that this conceals the fact they called it air support was a Reaper UAV which proceeded to loose off a Hellfire missile, which most probably ended up with 2 children with shrapnel in the stomach the next day.
With increasing pressure due to the publications, Julian Assange feared an imminent extradition to the US, and in 2012 was forced to seek asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy.
El gobierno del Ecuador, fiel a su tradición de proteger a quienes buscan amparo en su territorio o en los locales de sus misiones diplomáticas, ha decidido conceder asilo diplomático al ciudadano Julian Assange.
Can you hear me? I ask President Obama to do the right thing. The United States must renounce its witch hunt against WikiLeaks. The United States must dissolve its FBI investigation. The United States must vow that it will not seek to prosecute our staff or our supporters. The United States must pledge before the world that it will not pursue journalists for shining a light on the secret crimes of the powerful. There must be no more foolish talk about prosecuting any media organization, be it WikiLeaks or be it the New York Times.
¿Por qué se dio el asilo a Assange? Assange me parece que entra en la embajada en julio. Casi 2 meses nos pasamos estudiando el caso de Julian Assange. Ni siquiera te puedo decir es que estábamos de acuerdo con todo lo que había hecho Assange. Pero era claro que no había garantías para un debido proceso. Era claro que desde Estados Unidos ciertos grupos tremendamente agresivos, los halcones norteamericanos, querían juzgar a Julian Assange. Había grandes probabilidades de su extradición a Estados Unidos, donde podía enfrentar incluso la pena de muerte.
And so began Julian Assange's 7-year-long stay inside the tiny Ecuadorian embassy in central London.
Can everyone hear me? Hello, Cambridge, can you hear me? I can hear you, Andrew. I can see a room. Bye, everyone. Just nod or wave if you can hear me.
My name is Ed Snowden. I'm 29 years old. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA in Hawaii.
29-year-old young man in a foreign jurisdiction that he had no experience with, the subject of the largest intelligence manhunt the world has ever seen. And the realities were, for Edward Snowden, knew he was going to be smashed. And at that moment, he reached out and asked us for help. We managed to get him out of Hong Kong. But when he landed in the Moscow airport, the American government had cancelled his passport.
While all of these news organizations around the world, all of these publishers were trying to get a piece of the story, and there was only one publisher that actually said, we want to help the source. We want to make sure he's okay. We want to make sure that no matter what happens, you know, he has somebody on his side, and that was WikiLeaks.
En el momento que pasa Snowden, se cierran las puertas diplomáticas. O sea, eso fue un cerrón de puertas en Reino Unido. Eso cerró las posibilidades de discusión y negociación. O sea, ese fue el precio por la libertad de Snowden fue la libertad de Julian.
Assange was aware of the possible consequences of helping Snowden.
I think that is an important lesson, that actually an organization that specializes in defeating surveillance for national security cases was the organization that was able to do this. Yes, we had some diplomatic contacts and we certainly had the will and the desire to not see another Chelsea Manning, but I think a lot of it, we couldn't have done that if we hadn't specialized in these secure communications techniques.
Despite the increasing threats and deteriorating conditions in the embassy, WikiLeaks continued to publish.
Some of the CIA's most sophisticated and effective spying tools apparently pried open tonight with the help of WikiLeaks. The anti-secrecy group says it's obtained thousands of files.
The CIA is equipped with a variety of hacking tools to crack into phones, cars, computers, even smart TVs.
As a result of these publications, in 2017, the newly appointed director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, in an unprecedented manner, dedicated his first public address to a publisher.
Julian Assange and his kind are not the slightest bit interested in improving civil liberties or enhancing personal freedom. They have pretended America's First Amendment freedoms shield them from justice. They may have believed that, but they are wrong. WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
The private security company UC Global, hired by Ecuador to protect Assange, cut a deal with the CIA to spy on Assange and the Ecuadorian diplomats.
Together with these is the immediate accessibility to the newest major exposition, convention, and meeting facility in the city of Las Vegas.
In 2016, the owner of UC Global, David Morales, flew to Las Vegas to attend a security fair.
As soon as Morales returned from this fateful trip to Las Vegas, he began bragging to his employees back in southern Spain that we will from now on be playing in the first division, using a soccer metaphor, a football metaphor. But they were violating their contract with Ecuador and secretly working for the Americans via Sheldon Adelson.
The CIA laundered payments to UC Global through Las Vegas Sands, a company owned by Trump megadonor Sheldon Adelson.
Una persona que no se identifica, me contacta, me llama por teléfono y recuerdo perfectamente que cuando comienza la conversación me indica: hola, tú no me conoces, pero yo a ti sí te conozco perfectamente. Entonces yo le pregunto, ¿pero y de qué me conoces? Y él me indica: te conozco porque durante mucho tiempo has sido uno de mis objetivos. Te he seguido, te he grabado, he escuchado tus conversaciones, tengo toda tu documentación personal, tu pasaporte. Durante un montón de tiempo has sido uno de mis principales objetivos.
An elaborate plan was set up between Morales and the CIA to install surveillance cameras with audio capabilities and implant covert microphones in strategic places, such as below this fire extinguisher in the embassy's meeting room and behind this box in the toilet. Assange held meetings in this toilet for fear of being spied on.
En lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CIA.
The CIA's increasing obsession to entrap Assange alarmed a UC Global staffer who blew the whistle when asked to target Assange's family and even plot an attempt against his life.
They came forward and they spoke to our lawyers and they exposed what had been going on there because they had played a part in it. And they said that what their boss had been telling them is that they were working for the CIA and that those instructions about getting Gabriel's DNA, that was coming from the other side of the Atlantic. These instructions were coming from the United States.
It reads like some really terrible spy novel. Plots to kidnap, plots to possibly poison Julian Assange while he was in the embassy. I mean, it's almost too crazy to be real.
And it is real. It's hard for people to understand that such lawlessness is possible. So there's incredible criminality that has been going on in order to gather information about Julian's lawyers and his family and journalists who were visiting him. I mean, it's shocking, and I'm very fearful. I've been in a permanent state of fear for years.
UC Global sent video, audio, and other information about Assange, WikiLeaks staff, his visitors, and the Ecuadorian diplomats to a CIA server. They also recorded Assange's medical consultations and went as far as recording Assange's privileged legal conversations with his lawyers.
When Daniel Ellsberg was on trial for the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, his case was thrown out because it came out that Nixon had ordered a raid on his psychologist's office to try and get information which was embarrassing to Ellsberg. So, of course, that should have happened, and it was right that it happened. Assange has been surveilled by the CIA. That by itself should mean the case is thrown out. There's no chance you can have a fair trial if the people who are prosecuting have been surveying the defendant as he's been having privileged conversations with his lawyers. It's completely irregular that it hasn't been thrown out on those grounds already. I mean, really is outrageous.
I didn't expect to find torture, to be honest. I thought, well, this is, the UK, they've arrested him, they'll treat him well, maybe there's some issues, procedural issues, but I was genuinely shocked then that we found all the symptoms that you would find typically in a person who has been exposed to psychological torture. And in that context, I have to stress that psychological torture is by no means torture light. It is very serious. In fact, psychological torture was initially systematically developed by the Nazis. When they were not able to break resistance fighters with physical means, they developed psychological torture because it was even worse.
He was arrested in April 2019. Within a couple of months, probably less, he'd lost up to 15 kilos in weight. And his brother Gabriel, who I went in to see him with once, was shocked when he held his arm and realized how thin he was. He was subjected to a psyops operation, I would think. It certainly had its effect on him physically and no doubt mentally.
Torture is being used against Julian Assange to intimidate the world, to show them, if ever you get the idea to disclose our secrets and to expose our dirty laundry to the world, this is what's going to happen to you.
I feel like Julian's life might be coming to an end. It's been 10 years of breaking someone down, of trying to destroy his life. And it's a well-known pattern, whistleblowers, people who expose the powerful, they destroy them.
Throughout the 10 years that the Assange case has been ongoing, there have been a number of irregularities: the destruction of evidence by prosecutors, arbitrary detention, lack of access to his lawyers, judges with alleged conflicts of interest, mistreatment, illegal espionage, and the political nature of the charges themselves. All this is reason enough to shut the extradition proceedings and the prosecution down, but Assange still faces 175 years in prison.
Julian Assange is now in a high security prison in conditions which are quite close to solitary confinement, where he is at serious risk of contracting COVID, simply because of an indictment from the Trump administration in respect of publications for which he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, publications for which he won the Walkley Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism. That's how stark this situation is.
Come on, buddy. I gotta do is pick up a weapon.
We started by looking at the husband of the Chief Magistrate, Lady Arbuthnot, who's made a number of rulings on the Assange case. We found that her husband was a Conservative Defence Minister. He financially benefited from corporations that had been exposed by WikiLeaks. We then did an investigation of her son, who is a cybersecurity expert and the vice president of a private equity group. And we found that this private equity group was heavily invested in a firm called Darktrace, which was set up by the British intelligence establishment. So huge conflicts of interest. She has never recused herself in the case, which is irregular in itself, because I've talked to lawyers who have said if there's any hint of conflict of interest, judges will recuse themselves very early on, but she never has.
It's just constant.
It's constant. Yeah. We've had this issue before with Belmarsh as well. Apparently they didn't know about the booth.
So this is a constant problem. Whether I'll turn up for a prison visit with him down at the prison and they won't have brought him out, which means I sit there on my own for an hour while he's coming in, or while we're coming into the prison there's delays getting in because there's huge queues and security's not working properly, so I don't actually get in to see him until half an hour after the actual visit time has started, and he's sitting there on his own wondering whether anyone's turning up. And it just means that a 2-hour visit ends up being only an hour or less, and we lose time. And so, or we turn up to court being told that we'll have the whole day with him, and instead when we get there we're told, no, actually there's no facilities, you can only have an hour with him. And this has been constant for months and months and months on end, which has really limited our ability to get through any of the evidence with him. This is a hugely complicated case with a huge amount of evidence to get through.
Assange is a symbol, really, of the American state's affront at having its secrets put out in the public domain. You know, that's what it comes down to, and it's why I think of it as a political case. He's been blamed for a whole series of things which are patently untrue, but the impetus behind the extradition request has not stopped, which tells you it wasn't to do with those things. It's about high politics and him being a symbol of what they see as an assault on the American state. But most of the rest of the world will see as legitimate journalism.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS?
I hired O.J. Simpson's jury consultant in my case. He has never lost a case. He represented O.J. Simpson and William Kennedy Smith and George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin case. He's a winner. And we got him a security clearance. He came to Washington and he reviewed all the documents. And at the end of it, he said to me, if we were in any other district in America besides the Eastern District of Virginia, I would say, let's go for it. We're going to win. But the Eastern District of Virginia, he said, your jury would be made up of people from the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, and intelligence community contractors, or their family members. He said, you don't stand a chance in the Eastern District of Virginia. That's why they charged you there. I fear the same thing for Julian, that they charged him in the Eastern District of Virginia because it's called the espionage court, because no national security defendant has ever won a case there.
And when we see now how the British judiciary, who has a long tradition of rule of law, a proud tradition of that, has delivered a complete travesty of a trial, where the defendant has not had the right to prepare his defense, where he has not had access to his own lawyers, where we have court judges refusing to consider objections for conflicts of interest. Even in the UK, he's not going to get a fair extradition trial. So this is no longer in the hands of the judiciary. The judiciary is unwilling or unable to deal with this according to the rule of law. This is now in the hands of the public and in the hands of the media to inform the public about what is going on.
Free Julian Assange! On February the 24th, 2020, the first part of Julian Assange's extradition hearing took place.
I'm here from Reporters Without Borders. We've been monitoring all week. Today we were again concerned about Mr. Assange's well-being, and frankly the treatment is dehumanizing. The fact that he is an afterthought almost. Twice now this week, proceedings have started without a realization that he was not even yet present.
Julian is not receiving a fair hearing. To start with, he can hardly and barely hear what's going on in the courtroom. He cannot communicate with his lawyers without being observed and overheard by officials from the State Department, from the embassy, and from the Eastern District Court of Virginia. So how can he actually have a fair opportunity? And he, as he said, when he was attempted to communicate with the judge, there's been enough spying on the communication between me and my lawyers.
The remainder of the extradition hearing recommences on September 7th, 2020. Due to COVID restrictions, Assange has not been allowed to see his lawyers in over 6 months. On June 24th, the US Department of Justice published a replacement superseding indictment on its website, but it was only delivered to the court 3.5 weeks before the hearing and after the deadline to present new evidence had come and gone. This left Assange and his defense team with little time to adequately prepare a defense. Facing 175 years in prison, Julian Assange will likely not see his lawyers until the day of the hearing.
This is not about left or right in politics. We can unite on this. Please tell everybody that you know that they have to side with Assange and fight against the extradition. If they tell you, I would rather fight for the environment or against animal cruelty or gender equality, tell them they are about to take every right away from you. You will not be able to fight for any other cause. We are talking about the fundamentals here. We must fight against the extradition. We must save Julian Assange.
My name is Christian Rapson, the editor of WikiLeaks. The topic of our event today is the Iraq war logs. The release by WikiLeaks on 22nd of October 2010 of the largest leak in military history. What was published that day was 391,832 field reports from the US military, covering all events in Iraq up until 2009. It was the diary of the war. Never before had people seen such a detailed evaluation by the military itself on what went on. The WikiLeaks was working in an alliance with several media at the time. One of the media partners was the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London, which put all its efforts and its journalists working on going through these files and mining out stories from it. They produced content for media, including documentaries for Channel 4 and for Al Jazeera, English and Arabic. All the media partners were The Guardian in London, Der Spiegel in Germany, the New York Times in the US, and Le Monde in France, and several others, including the Swedish national television. Now, I have two guests here today to talk about this release and the importance of it, both in terms of content and on journalism in a broader sense, because never before had such a broad alliance of media from several countries been brought together and worked together on a single project. The stories were very noteworthy. They included such things as previously unreported civilian deaths, which were monitored by the US military but not released publicly. 15,000 deaths were unreported publicly. What were in those files? It included some very many events of civilian killing, such as at checkpoints, where I believe 700 events were found where people were killed at the US checkpoints because the people didn't stop too early or driving too fast, according to the estimate of the soldiers. Several things of that nature that I'm sure that my co-panelists here today will mention in their talk. But I would just want to mention before we go ahead that the importance of the Iraq war log is also noteworthy because they are one of the major foundation of the indictment against Julian Assange, who is now facing 18 counts. 17 of them are based on an archaic legal structure called the Espionage Act, never before used against a journalist. So the case of Julian Assange and the importance to fight against his extradition from the UK to the United States is extremely important, not just on a personal level, but because of the implication it will have for the future of journalism if he is extradited. Now, we will be taking questions later on after I introduce my panelists and give them a few minutes each to talk. You can write your questions on the Q&A on the Zoom or deliver the questions to us via social media where we'll pick out my colleagues. Now, let me introduce the two panelists, fine panelists here today, great journalists. We have Ian Overton, the investigative journalist who was director of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism back in 2010, where people didn't get much sleep and had to work under extreme time pressure and, of course, political pressure because of the animosity that we knew we would be facing from the United States because of this release. Then we have Chris Woods, a fantastic journalist who was at the Bureau at the time, but moved on and is now, he was a founder of Air Wars, a not-for-profit transparency organization aiming to monitor military activity in war zones and civilians' death. Their website is airwars.org. Now, thank you, both of you, for coming here today to this event. I would like to give you the first word, Ian, to discuss and reflect back on this eventful time back in 2010.
Yeah, indeed, a decade passes far too quickly. But so it was a remarkable moment. First meeting Julian, I met him at the Frontline Club, where he was being interviewed by CNN. And I think all of this was quite new to Julian, really. He wasn't that accustomed to the media glare. And I arrived, we had a brief chat, then he was straight into an interview with CNN. And the CNN journalist was I would say, quite robust, bordering on even hostile. And Julian, at the end of it, came to me and he said, I think I might need some tips on how to handle interviews because he didn't feel comfortable. And it struck me that, you know, what unfolded in the months and years later was probably quite a seismic shift in terms of his own experiences. I don't think it was what he was actively seeking in terms of all the exposure that followed. But Julian was working straight off the back of having come out with the Afghan leaks and the logs, and that had obviously partnered with The Guardian and another print. But the Bureau, we quickly established that the Bureau had an offering where people like Chris and myself had a broadcast background, and we could work with WikiLeaks, work with the evidence of found within the logs, and as you articulated, tried to do work for broadcast. So we teamed up. It was quite a sort of an innovative approach in a way, taking a large body of evidence and then putting that out for BBC radio, for Arabic media, for dispatches on Channel 4, and also we did some of the work for Le Monde website, as well as producing our own online content that we were very lucky went on to win an Amnesty Award. So, I mean, in terms of the sort of enormity of it, not only was it the world's largest ever military leak of information, but we were also doing something quite revolutionary, I think, in terms of media output. We were getting out on radio, online, broadcast, and in different languages. And so this was, you know, lots and lots of moving blocks. And I was very, very lucky to have people of caliber like Chris and others working with me, somebody called James Ball, who I know some of you may know, and others, who were very, very good, amazing journalists, really, who really ran at this, understood the gravity of what we were doing, the historical importance of what we're doing. And so over the forthcoming months and weeks and months, that after Julian agreed to this basic premise that we would lead the charge on broadcast output, we had this, as you said, sleepless nights, a hive of activity, the oddity of the fact that the Bureau was broken into a number of times, and the theft of computers therein, where there was never a suspect that was led towards prison, at least, and a moment where I was woken up very early one morning with a knock on the door, and I went down, and somebody I knew in the intelligence services just said to me, "Yeah, they're looking at you," and then ran off, which I thought was a strange awakening. But the output, and we worked very closely with Julian, talking about the measures of output, what should be redacted, what should not be redacted, the ethical duties and the protection of civilians, the protection of sources, etc., in terms of the output. What was one element of what we were doing. Obviously, we were doing standard investigative journalism process, triangulating evidence. And then on top of all of that was this remarkable effort to try and transform all this into broadcast. It wasn't just us hammering computers, putting out print. It was making films. It was creating radio, which takes a huge amount of effort and output. And it is really a testimony to the strengths of the team that I was lucky to bring together, that they produced some things that were not only revelatory and absolutely damning and condemning of the US military in that area, but I think have had long-term reverberations. And on a personal level, and I think Chris may attest to this as well, I mean, my life since then has very much been dominated by the legacy of the Iraq war logs. I've written a book on global gun violence. I've written a book on suicide bombers, both of which I relied on WikiLeaks evidence for the book. And I currently run a charity which investigates explosive violence use against civilians, of which Iraq and the reverberating impact of the Iraq war on the rest of the Middle East has a fundamental impact. So, I mean, I think, and this is probably a good time for Chris to pop in, but to talk about how the reverberations of the war logs on a personal level were profound, and I think on a societal level have yet to be truly understood.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that opening. We'll talk later about maybe the broader implication of the release, but Chris, your original or opening thoughts, go ahead.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, so my background to this was I had actually covered the invasion of Iraq. Well, in fact, the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, and then have been there for the invasion with the BBC, and then have been back into Iraq almost every year from 2003 onwards. So I had a very deep personal knowledge of the disaster that was the Iraq conflict. And as we know, the war began with a lie and then was sustained by lies. And in 2010, when we published, the war was still ongoing. Of course, it would run for another 3 years before the US and UK eventually withdrew. We were routinely, as journalists, lied to and misled by the British and American militaries. To give you an example, I was in Basra in the late 2000s after British forces had pulled out of that city. And we had managed to get a film crew into Basra. One of the more extreme factions had got control of the city, and they were executing women on the street at the time for showing too much ankle. It was they were pushing apart couples who were in mixed Sunni Shia marriages. It was a disaster, actually, the British withdrawal, and the Americans and the Iraqi military eventually had to go in and recapture the city. I remember being on the British base. The British would not intervene. They would not stop. And a British military public affairs officer telling us to our face, a Panorama team, that everything was fine in Basra. There was no problem. Nobody had any trouble there. And we said, this is ridiculous. We have a team there. We know what's happening. Why are you telling us this? And of course, that was their job. Their job was propaganda. And so when the Iraq war logs came along, it was immediately apparent what an extraordinary trove of material this was on a current conflict. And that was what was so remarkable about it, that would immediately and fundamentally change our understanding of that conflict. And there was a moral duty on us as journalists to publish that information, to make it available and to change public perceptions around that war. And if you look at the caliber of news organizations that came in on the Iraq war logs, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, Al Jazeera, Channel 4 with dispatches, it was, absolute top caliber news organizations came in and invested very significantly in that project. And as Ian has talked to, what the logs contained, I mean, there was so much, there were so many stories, we had to simply triage it. We had to decide which were the most compelling stories that we would go with. What would we focus on that would most illuminate the disaster of this war? And two that always stood out for me was the very widespread killing of Iraqi civilians by American forces at roadblocks. So basically, as the insurgency began to gain momentum in Iraq, American troops, they were incapable of distinguishing civilians from potential suicide bombers, and they were just opening fire on Iraqi civilians, and hundreds died. And all of this had been kept secret. I had experienced it myself. I'd almost been opened fire on with my Panorama crew going into an American base on one occasion. We knew how trigger happy they were. What we didn't know was this was systemic. This was a very profound problem, and also one that the US military internally was aware of. They were aware that this was something happening across Iraq, but they weren't responding to it and putting that in the public domain. Kristen, you mentioned at the beginning about the 16,000 additional deaths. Of course, the Iraq war logs contain details of almost 70,000 civilian deaths, many of those not killed by American and British forces, by the way. They were tracked by the US and Britain as the insurgency grew, and effectively a civil war had broken out in Iraq between Sunni and Shia, which had been stoked by Al-Qaeda in the ensuing chaos post-invasion. But within those 60,000 deaths in the war logs were 15,000 that Iraq body count had not previously known about. So there were actually far more civilian deaths there. And again, back to this question of lies. We had been repeatedly told by the American military, we don't do body counts. And indeed, that's where the name Iraq Body Count comes from, of that wonderful NGO that to this day still counts civilian deaths in Iraq. And the Iraq war logs stripped that veneer away and showed us quite clearly that they had been tracking civilian deaths from the beginning. They had comprehensive data on those deaths. They chose not to reveal that information and chose to claim that they weren't gathering that information. And so morally, there's never in my mind been any doubt that it was entirely the right thing for WikiLeaks to make the material available, and entirely proper for news organizations to publish that material.
Thank you, Chris. You mentioned the lies and about the documentation of the civilian deaths there. It comes to mind that I was involved in the release of the collateral murder video, where it shows the killing of a dozen civilians, many of them unarmed. Of course, in the field report, actually on that incident, all those who were killed were listed as enemy combatants. So it was quite difficult, I gather, of course, to go through the documents and cipher through, because there was this attempt to put the stamp of combatant on every civilian that was killed. Another thing that I want to mention, which I think was very much a moral blow to the U.S. military and the British forces in Iraq, was the fact that it became known that these forces were handing over detainees to Iraqi forces, where they were then tortured and killed. There was a demand to basically register all this, but strictly the U.S. forces were forbidden from intervening. Now, how damaging was that? And maybe in a sense in totality as well, Ian, did this change the entire narrative? Did this change the view of the entire Iraq invasion rather than a war?
I was very struck around a year after the logs came out that I'd been invited to Kazakhstan to give a talk as part of a forum of investigative journalism. And Daniel Finkelstein, who is now a member of the House of Lords, who was an FT columnist, was there on the panel. And Finkelstein, who's a very influential journalist in the UK, said openly, and there was nothing new in the Iraq logs. We didn't find anything of any substance or newness. And I really lost my temper. I think I may have even sworn because I was so offended by this belief that you know. And this was, I think, in a way, a media mantra that particularly came out of the sort of pro-government, pro-military papers, that there was nothing new in here, nothing to see, and we should move on and don't cause a fuss. That was the number one. And I think it was probably a coordinated attempt to try and spike the story. The second thing, which I thought was quite egregious, was this way in which those media entities who were not part of the consortium almost saw it as their moral duty to do whatever they could to try and unpick the validity of our reporting, partly through personal attacks on Julian Assange. And Julian, I think, so I recall being interviewed for 2 hours by The New Yorker for a piece they were doing on the Iraq war logs and Julian. And I basically said everything that we're probably going to be saying in this podcast of great detail around the nature of what we found within there. I went through every single element of the big revelation. And then at the very end, she said, well, give me some personal detail on Julian. And I said, well, he was always wearing his leather jacket. I mean, that's all I said. It was a pithy sentence thrown away at the end of 2 hours. I think I was a bit tired. Anyway, that's the only thing that they included in the interview. And I saw this time and time again where Julian became the story, even though I don't think that he was deliberately trying to create that. And the revelations that we found within the log were not amplified in the way that I thought they were. And then this later, I think, had an impact in that the government, particularly the US government and the UK government, was not forced into doing any action. Nick Clegg made a claim at the time that he was going to set up an historical allegations investigations unit. It was called IHAT, and there was some funding put into this, but IHAT closed around a year ago with no valid prosecutions made. And when I began to investigate IHAT, the International Historical Allegations Team in Iraq, the Iraq Historical Allegations Team, and I began to interrogate their intent, their capacity, and their function, I found out that there wasn't one person on the paid staff of IHAT who spoke Arabic, as an example. So the UK government's own historical allegations team in Iraq didn't employ anyone who was an Arabist. And I think that really sums up the response to the Iraq war. But at the same time, though, I do think there was virtue and valor in what we did, in that we did create, as Chris has said, hard evidence that there was lies and repeated lies by the UK and the US governments. We showed that the military's in-ground force operations do body counts. And I think that has molded a lot of the work that Chris and I are involved in now in ensuring that civilians have a moral duty for their deaths and injuries to be recorded. And ultimately, I think that what it showed is that the militaries, when they wage war, are compiling a lot more data than they ever had admitted to before. And I think that's a very potent precedent in terms of future wars waged.
Thank you. Chris, I have a question here from Malcolm Storek. He's asking, do we have a reliable number for civilian deaths in Iraq? I want to ask this of you, Chris, but also I want to mention, you said this was released when the Iraq war was still going on. It has been maintained that the war log release had an impact to end the presence of US troops in Iraq when the al-Maliki government in Iraq denied the US troops the impunity that they were requesting. So maybe your thoughts on that and the original question about actually the civilian deaths in the country.
The impunity question was certainly key to the Obama administration's decision to withdraw from Iraq. Although I think that was primarily actually driven by Eric Prince's mercenary organization, the Blacks. I can't remember the name of the organization off the top of my head. He's changed the name so many times, but that had gunned down multiple Iraqi civilians, and the outrage over that and the fact that they had been given effective immunity was, I think that was a bigger driver. But of course the Iraq war logs played into that. In terms of the question of civilian harm, is there a definitive number? It really depends, how you count this. How many Iraqi civilians were directly killed by American and British forces? The most authoritative data on this is still with Iraq body count, and we are looking at many tens of thousands over the duration of the war. Then, of course, there are indirect deaths, and far more Iraqis died in the civil war that was unleashed as a consequence of the invasion, really beginning in the 1990s. Absolutely atrocious civilian casualties when that Sunni-Shia effective civil war began. Interestingly, the Americans, they did in the end intervene. And I think it is fair to say that, under Petraeus, America in the end did choose to pay a blood price to put troops into those communities that were fighting as a way of ending or trying to end that civil war. So I think it's fair to say that having sat on the sidelines for several years, the Americans eventually did intervene. And very much lost their lives as well, several thousand in 2016. So, and then of course there's the broader indirect deaths, and we knew for many years that, for example, very high infant mortality in Iraq that had preceded the invasion because of the sanctions, and then the absolute collapse of Iraqi society and infrastructure that takes place in 2008. And to this day, much of Iraq hasn't recovered. Almost 20 years old. So still obscenely high mortality, low life expectancy, poor educational outcomes. You look at the city of Mosul today, there's no functioning hospital in Mosul. That's to do with a different war, but again, ISIS would never have happened without the invasion of Iraq. There are how far do you want to go in trying to understand the desperate impact of that calamitous decision to invade Iraq? You're looking at hundreds of thousands of deaths overall if you go for that broadest count. Pick your number, I guess.
I guess there is a consensus that, of course, the situation in Iraq did create the breeding ground for ISIS, just in the same way as the bombing of Cambodia by Nixon and Kissinger created the scenario for the Khmer Rouge to come to power, and all the atrocities and genocide that were happening in that country. In terms of the effect, of course, we had Libya, we've had involvement in Syria, we had the drone wars, but do you believe that there's a possibility that the release of the Iraq war logs, all the exposition of all the lies in justifying the war and during the war, may have diminished the desire of the United States to enter into a conflict on the same scale?
Well, I think that certainly that there is a reticence of both the US government as well as the UK government putting boots on the ground. And I think that the work that, again, Chris and I are very much involved in our own way is analyzing the consequence of that decision, because what we've seen is a shift from maybe Humvees on the ground to drones in the air. I think that it'll be difficult to say that the drones in the air is a direct consequence of one thing alone. It's advancements in technology. It's the very nature of the wars that are being fought mean that there is a belief by some that targeted killings is more effective when you take out certain Salafist jihadist group leaders, etc., etc. But I do think that the appetite for boots on the ground was certainly eroded to a degree by the revelations that the Iraq war logs revealed. And ultimately, to me, I always go back to this question, and I think this is a very compelling question. When you sit down with members of the military, particularly in the UK, but also in the US, I ask them, about the perception of who's the good guy in all this. And I think that, soldiers genuinely believe, generally and genuinely, that they are doing, the good thing, that they are not the Nazis of the modern age. And I'm not saying that the US and UK soldiers are, but, the Nazis believe they were the good guys at the time they were doing it. People generally believe in the wars they're fighting that they are doing good. When the great systemic picture is revealed, when repeated incidents of violence are shown, like the deaths of civilians at checkpoints, like the torture of detainees in US-run prisons, these things become seismic shocks in the body politic. And I think that the US did not want...
Possible not to be angry, really properly angry about abuse of process. We yet again saw the prosecution put to a witness unconnected with the event the lies told by Luke Harding about what Julian said in the El Moro restaurant, when the prosecution had refused to allow, and the judge had refused to allow, John Gertz, who was actually one of the 4 people present, who was an eyewitness, they refused to allow him to testify that those are lies and it did not happen. And yet every witness that comes along, they're putting to them the lie to get it again and again into the record that Julian said that informants deserved to be killed. So that's really starting to annoy me now, that they refused to let the eyewitness give evidence, but they keep putting the lie deliberately into the record. And then we saw Khaled El Masri, a victim of terrible torture and extraordinary rendition, found by the European Court of Human Rights to be a victim of terrible torture and of extraordinary rendition, was not permitted to give his evidence. First of all, his video link mysteriously did not work when it had been working previously at the key moment. Mysteriously, he couldn't be got on video. And then the judge, after an objection by the prosecution, ruled he should not give evidence because she did not have to see his evidence, because she could consider the WikiLeaks cable. And the American government said it objected to him giving evidence, making allegations of torture against the American government. And this is a man who the European Court of Human Rights has found in its highest chamber to be an extraordinary rendition victim. And he was not allowed in the court today to testify that he was tortured and to testify that WikiLeaks has helped him in his quest for justice. What we are seeing here is a cynical exercise by the judge and the United States government acting in cahoots to use this trial to prevent information from coming out. This trial is not about finding the truth. This trial is about suppressing the truth. It's a disgrace.
Yeah.
Judge Bereza is a disgrace, and I am absolutely bloody sick of it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Greg! Bravo! Bravo! Bravo!
Great. Just to let you know that John
This is Radio Free Assange.
I'm quite proud of that. That's we have built a really grand project. In some ways, a grand dream to create a rebel library of Alexandria.
Hands up, Assange!
This is Radio Free Assange.
And we demand free Julian Assange! 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 No extradition! He won't get censored! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free Julian Assange! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange. Journalism is not a crime. Free Julian Assange.
No extradition!
You are listening to
Well, the most dramatic part of this morning was where the United States attempted to prevent, actually in the end did prevent, Khalid al-Masri from speaking in court. He's a proven victim of CIA rendition and torture. And it seems to me that what the American prosecution want to do in this case is they want to drag into court all the supposed accusations that they have that damage was done by WikiLeaks, but they want to suppress from coming into court, at least in this case, one absolutely clear case in which the world knows about something that it would never have known about if it weren't for the participation of WikiLeaks in breaking that story. So it wants to magnify invented bad and suppress recorded good in this case. And I'm not surprised that Julian stood up in court and said, I'm not prepared to have a torture victim's evidence suppressed in this court. And he made that point very powerfully, directly to the judge. Now, he isn't supposed to do that, of course, but personally I'm very glad that he does. I think he was absolutely right to do so. If you're not going to stand up to ensure that people who've been tortured for months on end, for 5 months, can't have their voice heard in the court, well, then you're not going to stand up for very much.
Thank you very much, John.
This is Radio Free Assange.
I'm quite proud of that. That's we have built a really grand project. In some ways, a grand dream to create a rebel library of Alexandria.
Hands up, Assange!
This is Radio Free Assange.
And we demand free Julian Assange! 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 No extradition! He wants extradition!
Well, what happened just before this lunch break was a dramatic event. We were supposed to hear from al-Masri, the torture victim who was renditioned and tortured for a month by the CIA, and his plight for justice. He was going to testify to the fact that the WikiLeaks revelations helped expose the pressure that the Americans put on Germany not to pursue his case, and with very blatant threats. It was obvious that the opposition, the prosecution, the American representatives in the courtroom had no desire to hear his testimony. They had objected to the testimony being read out, his full testimony into court. They wanted to redact his testimony. And the reply to that was to get him basically online, basically on a video connection and testify in court. When there was a problem arising with the technical issue this morning, the judge was very quick to try to go back to actually reading out the testimony instead of hearing the witness, to have him in court. And basically, in some sense, for the first time in person, being able to meet the representatives of the government who was responsible for his plight, for his torture. Mr. Lewis immediately agreed to that being read out, but it started out wanting that to be a summary, and of course they wanted to go through the testimony and redact whatever reference was made to his torture, to his rendition, and to the essence of what happened to him. And at that moment, Julian Assange rose in the dock and basically called out, "I will not have censorship of a torture victim in this court." There was a pause, and in the end, Mark Summers, Julian's lawyers, was able to read out the essence of al-Masri's testimony, which is extremely important in the entire context of the WikiLeaks revelations. And I think that should indicate all the effort that has been put by the opposition, by the US lawyers, aided somewhat by Barrett's decisions, to have this quashed. It should amplify the importance. I think people should revisit that story and look at the story in the context of this trial here, and because in essence it tells a story about what the WikiLeaks revelations were all about. It was about justice for victims.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful, bravo! Bravo!
This is Radio Free Assange.
I'm quite proud of that. That's we have built a really grand project. In some ways, a grand dream to create a rebel library of Alexandria.
Hands up, Assange!
This is Radio Free Assange.
And we demand free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange!
Jennifer Robinson's testimony.
Yeah, the testimony of Jennifer Robinson, Julian's lawyers, was read into the court records this morning as well. A very important information was revealed in her testimony, and goes to the story of the political nature of what is going on here. She told the story about the visit by Dana Rohrabacher, who is a former congressman from the US, who visited Julian Assange in 2017. And basically expressed that he was visiting Julian with the knowledge and approval of President Donald Trump. What Jennifer Robinson testified to was the fact that the congressman put on the table, which he described as a win-win situation. It was an offer of a pardon by Donald Trump in exchange for Julian Assange revealing the source of the DNC leak. Of course, Julian Assange did not agree to any such proposal. As any journalist, he would not reveal his sources, as no journalist does. But this offer goes to show the political nature of the entire story. And actually, after that offer was made and turned down, we saw, of course, stepping up in the effort by the Trump administration to go after Julian, which has resulted, of course, with us being in this courtroom where Julian is fighting against the extradition.
Thank you very much.
This is Radio Free Assange.
I'm quite proud of that. We have built a really grand project, in some ways a grand dream, to create a rebel library of Alexandria.
Hands up, Assange!
This is Radio Free Assange.
And we demand free Julian Assange! 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 No extradition! Anyone that's censored!
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free Julian Assange! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange. Journalism is not a crime. Free Julian Assange.
No extradition!
You are listening to
The best news of all is that courage is contagious. We have this myth sometimes, this myth that the future is something that is fixed, static, out there, waiting to happen to us. But the future doesn't happen to us. It's not fixed. It's not out there. The future